There's a box sitting in the Rutherford County Archives that nobody wants to open twice. Inside it, voices that shouldn't exist, speaking words they never said. A recording made in 1952 that contains conversations from people who weren't born yet. And one of those voices might be yours. Subscribe now because some American mysteries are still waiting in plain sight, and you need to hear what comes next. Murfreesboro, Tennessee sits quiet between Nashville's lights and the forgotten farmlands that stretch toward the Cumberland Plateau. It's a town built on Civil War battlefields and railroad tracks, where courthouse squares still hold the weight of 100 years. The kind of place where families stay for generations, where names repeat on gravestones, where the past never quite lets go of the present. In the summer heat, the air hangs thick with cicadas and the smell of tobacco barns that haven't been used in decades. The Rutherford County Historical Society operates out of a brick building on East Main Street that used to be a telephone exchange. Their archives smell like dust and paper and something else, something older, like the residue of voices that soaked into the walls. Mrs. Eleanor Voss had been the archivist there for 31 years when she found the box in 2019, labeled only with a number and the words, "Audio Collection, Uncatalogued." She brought it to her desk on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting nothing more than another set of forgotten town council meetings. What she found instead would make her hands shake every time she thought about it. Inside the box were 6 reel-to-reel tapes, each one carefully wrapped in brown paper and tied with string that had gone brittle with age. There was a handwritten note folded on top, dated August 1952, signed by a man named Thomas Ridley, who'd worked as a radio engineer. The note said only, "Recorded during routine frequency testing. Equipment malfunction suspected. Voices unidentified. Preserved for technical review." Eleanor threaded the first tape onto the Society's old reel-to-reel player, adjusted the volume, and pressed play. The sound that came through the speakers made her breath catch in her throat. At first it was just static, the kind of white noise you'd expect from 70-year-old magnetic tape degrading in a cardboard box. Then, beneath the static, voices emerged, clear as morning light breaking through fog. A woman laughing. A man talking about a car he'd just bought. Children singing something that sounded like a nursery rhyme but with words Eleanor didn't recognize. And then, cutting through it all, a voice that made Eleanor's skin go cold, because she knew it. She absolutely knew it. It was her own voice, speaking about things that hadn't happened yet, using phrases that didn't exist in 1952. She stopped the tape, rewound it, played it again. Same voice, same inflections, same slight lisp on her S's that she'd had her whole life. The voice was talking about a computer, about sending an email, about a movie that wouldn't be made for another 40 years. Eleanor Voss was born in 1963, 11 years after this recording was made. She unplugged the tape player, put the box in a locked cabinet, and didn't speak about it for 3 days. But silence has a way of becoming unbearable when you're carrying something impossible. Eleanor started making calls. She reached out to audio forensics experts, to university researchers, to anyone who might explain what she'd heard without thinking she'd lost her mind. Most of them dismissed it as a prank or a hoax, but Dr. Marcus Chen from Vanderbilt's audio engineering department agreed to come examine the tapes. He arrived on a gray October morning with equipment that looked like it belonged in a crime lab. Dr. Chen spent 2 weeks analyzing the recordings, running tests that Eleanor didn't fully understand but watched with desperate attention. He examined the magnetic particles on the tape, checked for signs of splicing or digital manipulation, compared the deterioration patterns with other tapes from the same era. When he finally sat down with Eleanor in the archive's back room, his face had gone pale. "These tapes are original," he said quietly. "They were recorded in 1952. Exactly as the documentation states. There's no evidence of tampering, no modern intervention, but the voices on them are discussing events from the 1990s, the 2000s, even 2018. Eleanor asked the question that had been keeping her awake. How many voices? Dr. Chen opened his notebook, and Eleanor saw pages filled with timestamps and transcriptions. "We've identified 47 distinct voices across all 6 tapes," he said. "We've been able to match 12 of them to living people in Rutherford County. All of them were born after 1952. Some of them weren't born until the 1980s. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And we've matched 3 voices to people who died in the last decade, but on the recordings, they're talking about things that happened after their deaths. The Historical Society decided to contact the people whose voices had been identified. They did it quietly, one by one, inviting them to come listen without explaining what they'd hear. Eleanor watched each person's face as they sat in front of the tape player, watched the moment of recognition, the confusion that followed, the denial that always came first. A man named Robert Harding, who owned a construction company, listened to himself discussing a house fire that destroyed his childhood home in 2001, 49 years after the recording was made. He was born in 1968. Subscribe to this channel because these stories don't stay buried forever, and the next one might be closer to home than you think. Sarah Mitchell was a high school teacher, 61 years old, born in April of 1958. On the tape, her voice was younger, but unmistakably hers, talking about her daughter's wedding, describing the dress, the flowers, the weather. That wedding had taken place in June of 2015. She listened to the recording 4 times before she spoke, and when she did, all she said was, "That's me. That's exactly what I said that day. How could this tape know?" Eleanor had no answer, because the tape had been sitting in a box since 1952. Untouched, documented, cataloged. The voices weren't having conversations with each other. They were fragments, snippets of speech that seemed to be pulled from different moments in time. Some lasted only a few seconds. Others went on for minutes. A teenager talking about a video game. An elderly woman describing a surgery. A child asking for something called chicken nuggets, which wouldn't become common in restaurants until the 1980s. The recordings captured ordinary moments, mundane details, the kind of things you'd forget you ever said. But here they were, preserved decades before they were spoken. Thomas Ridley, the radio engineer who'd made the original recording, had died in 1979. Eleanor tracked down his daughter, a woman named Claire who lived in Nashville and remembered her father as a meticulous, rational man who'd never believed in anything he couldn't measure. Claire agreed to meet Eleanor at a coffee shop on West College Street. She brought a box of her father's papers, old notebooks filled with technical diagrams and frequency calculations. "He mentioned that recording once," Claire said, stirring sugar into her coffee. Said it was the strangest thing he'd ever encountered. According to Claire, Thomas Ridley had been testing new radio equipment in August of 1952, trying to calibrate receivers for the local AM station. He'd been picking up interference on multiple frequencies, voices bleeding through from somewhere they shouldn't be. He assumed it was atmospheric conditions, some quirk of the ionosphere bouncing signals from distant cities, but when he listened closely, the voices were wrong. They used words that didn't exist yet. They referenced things that hadn't been invented. He recorded everything, documented it carefully, and then filed it away because he had no framework to understand it. "My father wasn't a superstitious man," Claire said, pushing the notebooks across the table. "But he told me once near the end of his life that he thought he'd accidentally recorded something that was leaking through time. Like radio waves that got bent somehow, picked up transmissions from the future instead of the past." She looked at Eleanor with red-rimmed eyes. "He said if he was right, it meant time wasn't what we think it is, that it's all happening at once, and we're just moving through it, and sometimes the barriers break down." Eleanor took the notebooks back to the archive and spent 3 nights going through them. Thomas Ridley had noted the exact frequencies where he'd picked up the voices, 1420 MHz, which wouldn't be used for civilian broadcasts in 1952. That frequency would later become significant in radio astronomy, associated with the hydrogen line, used to search for signals from distant stars. He'd also noted unusual electromagnetic readings in the area that week, spikes that his equipment couldn't fully explain. And he'd drawn a map, marking 3 locations in Rutherford County where the signals seemed strongest. The 3 locations formed a triangle. The first point was the old telephone exchange building, where the Historical Society now kept the tapes. The second was Fortress Rosecrans, a Civil War fortification on the edge of town where hundreds of soldiers had died in 1862. The third was a spot called Murfree Spring, the original water source for the earliest settlers, a place that had been considered sacred by the indigenous peoples who'd lived there centuries before. Eleanor stood in her office looking at the map and felt a cold certainty settle in her bones. But that was only the beginning of what they would discover. Dr. Chen returned with a colleague, a physicist named Dr. Amelia Torres, who specialized in temporal mechanics and quantum field theory. Together, they set up monitoring equipment at all 3 locations. measuring electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, anything that might explain why these specific places seemed to be connected to the recordings. What they found was subtle but consistent, a slight distortion in local spacetime barely measurable, like a lens that bent light in ways it shouldn't. It's as if these locations exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, Dr. Torres explained, though Eleanor only half understood. The Historical Society decided to digitize the tapes, to preserve them before the magnetic medium degraded any further. During the digitization process, something new emerged. The audio engineer handling the transfer called Eleanor down to the lab, his face white. "There's something underneath the voices," he said. "A pattern in the static. I ran it through analysis software, and it's not random noise. It's structured. It's information." When he played it for her, slowed down and filtered, Eleanor heard what sounded like Morse code, or something similar, repeating in loops beneath every voice. Nobody could decode it. The pattern didn't match any known communication system. Dr. Chen sent samples to cryptographers, to military signal analysts, to anyone who might recognize the structure. One researcher from the NSA called back 3 weeks later and said only, "Where did you get this? This encoding method doesn't exist yet." Then he hung up and wouldn't take any more calls. Eleanor made copies of everything and stored them in 3 separate locations, because she was starting to understand that some discoveries make you a target for questions you can't answer. More people came forward after word spread quietly through Murfreesboro. They'd heard rumors, whispers about voices from the future. A man named David Pryor, who'd been skeptical, agreed to listen to the tapes just to prove it was all nonsense. He sat down, put on the headphones, and went completely silent for 5 minutes. When he took them off, his hands were shaking. "That's me," he whispered. "That's me talking about my son's funeral. He died 3 years ago, but I'm saying things I only thought, things I never said out loud to anyone. How does this tape know what I was thinking?" The recordings weren't just capturing voices. They were capturing moments of private thought, internal monologues, things that were never spoken aloud but only lived in the mind. A woman heard herself praying, a prayer she'd said silently at her mother's bedside in 2012. A man heard himself rehearsing a speech he'd given at a retirement party, words he'd practiced in his car alone. The tapes were pulling from somewhere deeper than sound, somewhere that shouldn't be accessible to any recording device ever made. Eleanor started having nightmares about invisible microphones embedded in time itself, listening to everything everyone would ever think. Dr. Torres proposed a theory that sounded like science fiction, but was the only explanation that fit the evidence. She suggested that the specific geological and electromagnetic conditions in Murfreesboro might create what she called temporal echoes, moments where the past and future overlap just enough for information to leak through. "Think of time as a river," she said. "Usually it flows in one direction, but in certain places, under certain conditions, the water eddies, swirls back on itself. These recordings might be catching those eddies, voices from downstream making their way upstream." The question nobody wanted to ask was, if the tapes from 1952 contained voices from the future, what was being recorded now? Eleanor set up a modern digital recorder in the same location where Thomas Ridley had worked in 1952, using the same frequencies he'd noted. She let it run for 6 hours overnight. The next morning, she played back the recording with Dr. Chen and Dr. Torres present. For the first 3 hours, nothing but static. Then, at the 3:47 mark, a voice emerged from the noise. Young, clear, speaking English but with an accent nobody recognized. The voice was talking about Murfreesboro, describing buildings that didn't exist, streets that hadn't been built, people whose names meant nothing to anyone in the room. It mentioned a memorial for something called the event, which it dated to 2031. It described weather patterns that sounded like they'd been disrupted by something catastrophic. And then it said something that made Eleanor's blood freeze. They're still listening to the old tapes, trying to understand. They don't know yet that the recordings are warnings, not echoes. They don't know what's coming. Dr. Chen wanted to stop the project immediately. "We're dealing with something we can't control," he said. "Information from the future. If that's what this is, it violates causality. It could create paradoxes. We don't know what harm we might cause by knowing things we shouldn't know." But Dr. Torres disagreed. "If these are warnings, we have an obligation to understand them. Someone or something is trying to communicate across time. We can't just ignore it." Eleanor sat between them, holding the recorder, and thought about all the voices trapped on magnetic tape, speaking from times that hadn't happened yet. They continued the recordings for 6 more weeks, documenting everything, building an archive of voices from a future that might or might not come to pass. Some of the voices spoke about ordinary things, weather, traffic, daily routines that sounded similar to the present. Others spoke about changes that were harder to parse, new technologies, different social structures, conflicts that had no current context. And occasionally there were voices that seemed to be speaking directly to them, to the people in 2019 who were listening, offering guidance that was cryptic but deliberate. One voice, an older woman with a southern accent that sounded like she could be from Murfreesboro, said this: "If you're hearing this in the archive in the old telephone building, you need to know that the spring is the key. Murfree Spring. Something there anchors the phenomenon. Don't let them build over it. Don't let them disturb the ground. It's the only thing keeping the timeline stable." When Eleanor checked city records, she found that a development company had submitted plans to build a shopping complex directly on top of Murfree Spring. The construction was scheduled to begin in 8 months. Eleanor brought the recordings to the city council, along with Dr. Torres and Dr. Chen. She played selected segments, showed them the analysis, explained as carefully as she could what they'd discovered. The council members listened with expressions ranging from polite skepticism to open disbelief. One councilman laughed and said it was the most creative way he'd ever seen someone try to stop a development project. But the mayor, a woman named Patricia Hensley who'd lived in Murfreesboro her entire 73 years, asked to hear the tapes again privately. Mayor Hensley sat alone with Eleanor in the archive after everyone else had left. They played the voice of the older woman, the warning about the spring. Patricia's face went pale. "That's my voice," she said quietly. "That's me. But older. Maybe 20 years older. I'd recognize it anywhere." She listened to the warning again, then looked at Eleanor. "If that's me from the future telling us not to disturb the spring, then I believe her. I believe myself. I'll stop the construction." And she did. The development project was quietly shelved. The land around Murfree Spring designated as a historical preservation site. But the truth comes harder than you might imagine. 6 months after the construction was stopped, people in Murfreesboro started experiencing something new. Dreams. Vivid, precise dreams of conversations they would have, places they would go, things they would see. The dreams were specific enough to be tested. A teenager dreamed about a pop quiz in history class and could describe every question. It happened exactly as she'd dreamed 3 days later. A nurse dreamed about a patient she'd never met. A man who would come into the emergency room with a specific injury. He arrived 2 weeks after her dream, exactly as she'd seen it. The phenomenon spread slowly but steadily. Not everyone experienced it, but enough people did that it couldn't be dismissed. Dr. Torres returned to study the new development. She found that the electromagnetic anomalies around the 3 locations had intensified since the construction was stopped, as if preserving the spring had stabilized something that was trying to strengthen. "The barriers between different times are thinning here," she said. "Murfreesboro is becoming a place where past, present, and future are starting to overlap. I don't know if it will spread or if it will stay contained to this area." Eleanor went back to the original 1952 tapes, listening with new understanding. She realized that Thomas Ridley hadn't just stumbled onto this phenomenon. He'd been part of it. She found a recording where a voice, barely audible beneath the static, said his name, said it like a greeting, like someone who knew him. She tracked down more of his personal papers through Claire and found a journal entry from September 1952. "I heard someone call my name on the recording. A voice I didn't recognize. It said, 'Thomas, you're the first. You have to document everything. They'll need to understand how it started.'" The archive now contains over 300 hours of recordings from multiple time periods, all captured in Murfreesboro, all demonstrating the same impossible phenomenon. Voices speaking from when they shouldn't be able to speak, knowing things they shouldn't be able to know. The Historical Society keeps them in a climate-controlled vault, makes them available to researchers who sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. Most mainstream scientists refuse to acknowledge them. But those who've listened, who've heard their own voices or the voices of people they know, they can't deny what's happening. Eleanor Voss retired from the Historical Society in 2023, but she still goes to the archive twice a week. She sits in the room with the tape player and listens to new recordings that Dr. Torres and her team continue to make. Sometimes she hears voices she recognizes. Sometimes she hears her own voice, older now, talking about things she hasn't experienced yet. She's learned to listen without fear, to accept that time in Murfreesboro works differently than it does in other places. She's learned that some towns are thin places, where the walls between what was, what is, and what will be become permeable. The most recent recording, made last month, contains a voice that sounds like it could belong to a child not yet born. The voice is singing a song that doesn't exist, using words from a language that might not have been invented yet. But underneath the singing, if you listen carefully, there's another pattern in the static. Dr. Torres has been trying to decode it for weeks. She thinks it might be coordinates, spatial and temporal, pointing to other locations where the same phenomenon might be occurring. If she's right, Murfreesboro isn't the only place where time is breaking down. What would you do if you heard your own voice on a tape that was made before you were born? Would you listen to what it had to say? Would you believe it was really you? Or would you find a way to explain it away? The people of Murfreesboro don't have the luxury of denial anymore. They live in a town where the future whispers to the past, where warnings arrive decades before the danger, where time itself has become unreliable. Some of them have moved away. Others stay, curious, waiting to see what comes next. There's a question that haunts Eleanor late at night when she's alone with her thoughts. If these recordings are real, if they truly capture voices from the future, then everything everyone will ever say has already been said somewhere in time. Every choice has already been made. Every outcome already exists. Free will becomes an illusion, just a person walking a path that's already been laid out, already been recorded, already been heard by people in the past who are listening to tapes they shouldn't have. She doesn't like where that thought leads, but she can't shake it. The archive keeps growing. More tapes, more digital files, more voices from times that haven't happened yet. Dr. Torres wants to publish her findings, to make this phenomenon known to the wider scientific community. Dr. Chen thinks it's too dangerous, that the knowledge itself might be the catalyst that makes the future on the recordings inevitable. Eleanor doesn't know who's right. She just keeps documenting, keeps listening, keeps adding to the collection that Thomas Ridley started 70 years ago when he accidentally tuned his radio to the wrong frequency and heard tomorrow speaking to yesterday. If you go to Murfreesboro now, you won't see anything unusual. The town looks like any other mid-sized Tennessee city, with its chain restaurants and college campus and Civil War monuments. Murfree Spring is marked with a small historical plaque that doesn't mention temporal anomalies or voices from the future. The Rutherford County Historical Society appears normal, just another archive full of old papers and photographs. But if you know where to look, if you know who to ask, you can hear the tapes. You can listen to your own voice speaking from a time you haven't reached yet. Some people search for their voices deliberately, wanting to know what their future holds. Others avoid the archive entirely, terrified of hearing themselves speak about things they haven't done, choices they haven't made. Eleanor doesn't judge either response. She understands that knowing the future is a burden some people can carry and others can't. She's heard her own death on one of the tapes, heard herself speaking weakly about the view from a hospital window, describing grandchildren she doesn't have yet. It was dated 2041, 18 years from now. She listened once, then locked that tape away separately, marked with her name. The voice on the 1952 tape that sounds like the future mayor, the one that warned about the spring, said something else that Eleanor only recently noticed. Right at the end of that recording, barely audible, almost lost in static, tell them it's not about preventing the future. It's about understanding that time is a circle, not a line. What's recorded has always been recorded. What will be said has already been said. We're all echoes, and the spring is where all the echoes meet. Eleanor has thought about that statement for months, trying to parse what it means. Dr. Torres has a new theory, one she shares quietly with Eleanor over coffee. What if the recordings aren't from our future, she says. What if they're from a parallel timeline that runs alongside ours, slightly ahead, close enough that sometimes the barriers between them break down? That would explain why some of the recorded events match our reality perfectly and others don't. We might be listening to a version of Murfreesboro that exists 6 months ahead of us, or 6 years, or 6 decades. Eleanor asks if that makes it better or worse. Dr. Torres doesn't have an answer. Make sure you're subscribed because these mysteries are still unfolding, and the next voice on the tape might belong to someone you know. There are 37 people in Murfreesboro who've heard themselves on the 1952 tapes, speaking from times ranging from the 1960s to last year. They meet once a month in the basement of the Historical Society, a support group for people living with impossible knowledge. They share their experiences, hearing themselves discuss events that hadn't happened yet, listening to their own voices age across decades on a single tape. Some of them have tried to change what they heard themselves say, to prove that the future isn't fixed. None of them have succeeded. Every attempt to deviate from the recorded future has somehow led them back to speaking the exact words on the tape, in the exact tone, at the exact moment. A man named Gregory Walsh heard himself on a tape discussing a business deal that would make him wealthy. The recording was from 2018, captured on a tape made in 1952. He was skeptical, but he followed the path the recording suggested, invested in a startup, made connections with specific people, took risks he wouldn't normally take. In November 2018, he closed the exact deal his recorded voice had described, speaking the same words of celebration he'd heard on the tape. He's now convinced that hearing the recording didn't give him knowledge of the future. It created the future he heard. Eleanor has stopped trying to understand the mechanism behind the recordings. She's accepted them as a fact of Murfreesboro's existence, like the humidity in summer, or the way the old courthouse tower chimes every hour. What concerns her more is the pattern she's starting to see in the more recent recordings, the ones made in the last year. The voices from the future are becoming more anxious, more urgent. They speak about preparations, about gathering resources, about difficult decisions ahead. They mention dates in the late 2020s and early 2030s with a heaviness that suggests those years will be significant for reasons not yet clear. One recording, made 3 weeks ago, contains a voice that claims to be speaking from 2037. It's a young man, maybe in his 20s, speaking quickly like he doesn't have much time. To whoever is listening in 2024, he says, the spring stopped working in Twin I-31. The connections broke down after the event. We can't send messages anymore. This might be the last one that gets through. You need to preserve everything, the recordings, the research, all of it. It's the only proof that time ever worked differently. It's the only evidence that we were warned. Then static, and nothing else. Dr. Torres played that recording for Eleanor and asked what she thought it meant. Eleanor had no answer, but she's been having dreams lately. Dreams that feel too specific to be random. Dreams of Murfreesboro under a sky that looks wrong, with fewer buildings, different roads. Dreams of the archive underwater, papers floating, tapes dissolving in brown water. Dreams of voices calling out coordinates, trying to guide people to safety. She hasn't told anyone about the dreams because she's afraid they might be starting to happen to her. The bleed through from future to present that's affecting more and more people in town. The archive has become a pilgrimage site for researchers from around the world who've heard rumors of what's stored there. Eleanor screens them carefully, allows access only to those who approach the material with respect and serious intent. A physicist from CERN listened to the tapes and said they suggested the existence of what he called retrocausal information flow, information moving backward through time, which his equations predicted was possible but which he'd never seen evidence for until now. He left Murfreesboro white-faced and refused to discuss what he'd heard. There's a growing collection of recordings that don't contain voices at all, just sounds, footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing, the rustle of paper, the hum of machinery that doesn't exist yet. Dr. Torres has been analyzing these, trying to determine if they're also temporal echoes or if they're something else entirely. Her latest finding is disturbing. Some of the sounds seem to be recordings of recordings, like the tape player itself being recorded while playing back the original tapes. It suggests a loop, a feedback mechanism where future and past are listening to each other across an ever-decreasing gap. Eleanor found something in Thomas Ridley's papers that she'd missed before, a letter he wrote to a colleague in 1953 that was never sent. In it, he describes a dream he had, a dream of a woman with gray hair standing in an archive full of tapes, listening to his voice giving her instructions from a time that hadn't happened yet. In the dream, he wrote, I told her that I was the beginning, but not the cause. I told her the phenomenon had always existed, that Murfreesboro had always been a thin place, and that 1952 was just the first time someone had the technology to accidentally record it. I told her to keep listening, because the voices were trying to teach us something about the nature of time itself. The last tape Thomas Ridley made before he stopped recording was labeled Final Test, August 30th, 1952. Eleanor had listened to it dozens of times over the years, always finding something new in the layers of voices. Last week, she played it again with new equipment Dr. Torres had brought, technology that could separate individual voices more clearly than ever before. Buried beneath all the other voices, almost imperceptible, was one more sound. A voice that might have been Thomas Ridley himself, older, speaking from some time in the 1970s based on the background noise. All it said was, "I understand now. The recordings are a map. Follow them forward. Follow them back. They lead to the same place. Where that place might be, Eleanor doesn't know. But she has theories, shaped by 5 years of listening to voices that shouldn't exist. She thinks Murfreesboro sits at a point where time converges, where multiple timelines or temporal states overlap, creating a junction point that allows information to flow in directions it normally couldn't. She thinks Murphy Spring might be acting as some kind of anchor, a physical location that stabilizes this convergence and prevents it from spinning out of control. And she thinks that whatever event the future voices keep mentioning, it's connected to a disruption of that stability. The city has grown quieter about the phenomenon in recent years. There was a period in 2020 and 2021 when the story almost went viral, when podcasts and YouTube channels wanted to investigate, when the archive was flooded with requests for access. But Mayor Hensley and the Historical Society Board made a decision to limit publicity, to keep Murfreesboro's temporal anomaly as contained as possible. They worried about what would happen if too many people came looking for their futures, if the town became overrun with seekers and skeptics. So now the information spreads by word of mouth quietly, to those who need to know. But there's a truth emerging that Eleanor can no longer ignore, a truth that all the research and analysis is pointing toward. The recordings aren't predictions. They're not possibilities or probabilities or alternate timelines. They're fixed points in a structure of time that's more solid than anyone wants to believe. Every person who's heard themselves on the tapes has watched their recorded future unfold exactly as they heard it, down to the smallest detail. Every attempt to change that future has failed, or rather, has become part of the path that leads to the future on the tape. Free will and determinism aren't opposites in Murfreesboro. They're the same thing viewed from different angles. You choose freely, but you'll always choose what you've already chosen, what's already been recorded. This realization has broken some people. A woman named Jennifer Stokes heard herself on a tape making a decision she didn't want to make, walking away from a relationship she wanted to keep. She spent 2 years fighting against that future, making different choices, trying to stay when the tape said she would leave. But circumstances conspired, events unfolded, and in the end she found herself saying the exact words the tape had captured, making the departure she'd tried so hard to avoid. She left Murfreesboro after that, unable to live in a place where her choices felt like echoes of decisions already made. Dr. Chen has proposed shutting down the research entirely. We're studying something that might be better left unknown, he argues. Knowledge of the future doesn't free people, it traps them. Every person who hears their voice on these tapes loses something essential, the belief that their choices matter, that they're authoring their own lives. Maybe the ethical thing to do is destroy the recordings, stop making new ones, let Murfreesboro return to normal. Dr. Torres and Eleanor both disagree, but for different reasons. Dr. Torres wants to continue because the scientific implications are too important to ignore. Eleanor wants to continue because she thinks the voices are still trying to tell them something important. The newest recordings, the ones made in the past 3 months, have started to change in character. The voices are speaking more directly, addressing the researchers by name, offering specific guidance. One voice, claiming to be a researcher from 2029, said, "Eleanor Voss, if you're hearing this, you need to expand the monitoring to the other sites. The triangle isn't the only formation. There are 7 points total, scattered across Rutherford County. Together they form a larger pattern. Map them before 2026. After that, it becomes harder." Eleanor has been working with Dr. Torres to identify the other 4 locations, using electromagnetic readings and historical research. They've found 3 so far. One is an old cemetery on the county's southern edge, where Confederate soldiers are buried alongside victims of a yellow fever outbreak from 1878. The second is a farm that's been abandoned for 40 years, where the ground shows unusual mineral deposits that shouldn't exist in Tennessee soil. The third is a cave system that extends beneath the eastern part of the county, where early settlers reported hearing voices echoing from deep underground, voices speaking languages they didn't recognize. The electromagnetic readings at all three sites match the patterns at the original triangle, suggesting they're part of the same phenomenon. Eleanor stands at Murfree Spring sometimes, usually at dawn when the town is quiet and the water reflects the early light. She thinks about all the voices trapped in time, speaking across decades, trying to communicate something essential. She thinks about Thomas Ridley, alone in his radio station in 1952, hearing the future bleed through into his present and having the courage to document it instead of running from it. She thinks about her own voice on those tapes, speaking from years she hasn't lived yet, and wonders if she's already lived those moments somehow, if time is just playing catch-up with events that have always already happened. The question that haunts her most, the one she writes about in her private journal but never speaks aloud, is this: if someone from the future is listening to us right now, recording our voices for people in the past, what does that mean about the nature of consciousness itself? Are we living our lives or are we remembering them? Is there a difference? When her future self speaks on those 1952 tapes, is that Eleanor actually experiencing those moments in some parallel temporal state? Or is it just information, just data echoing backward through time without awareness attached to it? Dr. Torres thinks consciousness might be the key to understanding the whole phenomenon. Information can move through time, she says. We see that clearly in the recordings. But what if consciousness does too? What if awareness itself isn't confined to a single point in time? What if we're all existing simultaneously across all our moments and we just perceive it linearly because that's how our brains are wired? It's a theory that explains a lot but also makes everything more unsettling, because it suggests that the version of Eleanor who spoke on those 1952 tapes might be aware, somewhere, might be experiencing those words even as the 2024 version of Eleanor listens to them. The archive keeps growing, one recording at a time, one impossible voice after another. Eleanor has started cataloging them by decade, creating a timeline of Murfreesboro's future based on the dates mentioned in the recordings. Most of them cluster in the 2020s and 2030s, with fewer voices from beyond 2040. This might mean nothing, or it might mean something Eleanor doesn't want to consider, that there are fewer voices from the distant future because there are fewer people to record, or because the phenomenon stops working, or because something happens that makes the future less populated with voices than the past. She found a recording last week that she's been afraid to share with anyone. It's from 2063, one of the furthest dates they've captured. The voice is elderly, female, speaking slowly like someone who's very tired. To the archivists of the early 21st century, the voice says, "You're listening to the last generation that remembers when time was solid, when the past stayed past and the future stayed future. Everything after 2031 becomes fluid. Memory and prophecy blend together. You live your entire life in a single moment that keeps folding back on itself. We envy you, living in a time when tomorrow was still a surprise. Preserve that while you can." Then silence. Eleanor hasn't decided what to do with that recording. It suggests a future that's not just different but fundamentally altered, where the temporal stability that most people take for granted breaks down completely. It suggests that Murfreesboro's phenomenon might not be localized forever, that it could spread or intensify until it changes the basic structure of human experience. She shared it with Dr. Torres, who ran the analysis and confirmed the recording is consistent with all the others. Authentic, impossible, true. The support group for people who've heard their own voices has grown to 72 members. They meet every month and Eleanor attends sometimes, listening to their stories. A young woman heard herself discussing her PhD dissertation on a subject she hadn't chosen to study yet. A retired firefighter heard himself talking about a grandson who hadn't been conceived yet. They all described the same strange feeling, hearing themselves and recognizing it completely, knowing that when that moment comes in their real timeline, they'll speak those exact words without knowing why, pulled by a force they can't see toward a future they've already heard. One man in the group, a philosophy professor named Richard Delacroix, has developed a kind of peace with the phenomenon. We're not losing our free will, he tells the others. We're discovering that will and fate are the same thing. You will choose freely to say what you've heard yourself say. The choosing is real. The freedom is real. It's just that your future choices echo backward through time, creating the recording. Cause and effect make a circle, not a line. Some people find comfort in his perspective. Others think he's rationalizing away a horror that should be resisted. Eleanor has heard whispers of other places experiencing similar phenomena, though nothing as concentrated as Murfreesboro, a town in Montana where people dream of conversations before they happen, a village in Scotland where photographs sometimes show people who weren't there when the picture was taken, but who appear in that location years later, a laboratory in Japan where particle detectors occasionally register events 3 seconds before they occur. Dr. Torres has been collecting reports, building a database, wondering if Murfreesboro is unique or if it's just the place where the phenomenon became undeniable because someone had the right equipment at the right moment to record it. The 7 points that form the larger pattern across Rutherford County have been identified now. When Dr. Torres plotted them on a map and connected them, they formed a shape that neither she nor Eleanor recognized at first. It took a historian from Vanderbilt to identify it. The symbol matched a design found on pottery shards from the Mississippian culture that inhabited this region 1,000 years ago. The indigenous peoples who lived here before European contact might have known about the temporal anomalies, might have marked the sacred spots where time became thin, where past and future spoke to each other through the veil of the present. This discovery changed how Eleanor thinks about the phenomenon. It's not new. It's not caused by technology or modern development. It's been here all along, part of the land itself, part of the specific geology or geography or something else entirely that makes this location different from other places. Thomas Ridley didn't create the temporal echoes in 1952. He just found the right tool to make them audible, to prove they existed. The voices have always been here, speaking from other times, waiting for someone to listen. Eleanor has started bringing visitors to Murfree Spring, people who've traveled from across the country to understand what's happening in Murfreesboro. She brings them at dawn, when the water is still and the air is cool, and she plays recordings on a portable speaker. The voices echo across the spring, blending with birdsong and the sound of water moving over rock. She tells them about Thomas Ridley, about the pattern of 7 points, about the futures that have been heard and the past that haven't been forgotten. Most people leave without speaking, overwhelmed by the weight of standing in a place where time behaves differently. One visitor, a quantum physicist from MIT, told Eleanor something that stayed with her. Time might not exist the way we think it does, he said, standing at the edge of the spring. It might just be a convenient fiction our consciousness creates to make sense of the universe. Maybe in Murfreesboro that fiction is weaker. Maybe here you're closer to experiencing reality as it actually is. All moments existing simultaneously, accessible to each other, bleeding together like colors in water. Eleanor asked him if that thought comforted him or terrified him. He said both, equally. The recordings from 2031 that mention the event have grown more specific in recent months. They describe it as a shift, a moment when something fundamental changes. Some voices say it's a natural occurrence, an intensification of the temporal anomalies. Others suggest it's caused by human intervention, by someone or some organization trying to harness the phenomenon for purposes the voices don't specify. All of them agree that after the event, the ability to record voices across time becomes unreliable, sporadic, eventually stopping entirely. The spring, they say, goes quiet. Time solidifies again, but differently than before, like water that's been frozen and melted and frozen again, changed at a molecular level. Eleanor is 72 years old now. She knows the tape that contains her death is locked in a cabinet she visits sometimes but never opens. She's thought about listening to it again, hearing the details of her final days, but she's decided against it. Some futures should remain unknown until they arrive, even in a town where the future speaks to anyone willing to listen. She's made peace with the paradox of living in Murfreesboro, knowing that tomorrow is already recorded somewhere but still having to live as if her choices matter, because in a way she can't quite articulate, they do. The Historical Society will continue the work after Eleanor retires fully. Dr. Torres has taken a permanent position at a new institute dedicated to studying temporal anomalies, funded quietly by benefactors who've heard the tapes and understand their implications. They'll keep recording, keep documenting, keep trying to understand why Murfreesboro became a place where time refuses to flow in just one direction. They'll preserve the tapes, protect the 7 sites, Monitor the electromagnetic patterns and wait to see if the event the future voices describe will actually occur, or if hearing about it somehow prevents it. But the deepest mystery remains unsolved. The question that Eleanor writes on the last page of her journal before she closes it for the night. If the voices on the tapes are warnings, who or what is doing the warning? If they're not just random echoes but deliberate messages sent across time, then someone in the future is choosing to speak to the past. Someone knows that these recordings will be found, will be preserved, will be studied. Someone is trying to prepare people in 2024 for something that will happen in 2031, using technology from 1952 to bridge the gap. The intention behind it all remains unclear, lost in static and speculation. Eleanor's last thought, written in careful handwriting, is this: we are all living in someone else's memory and someone else's prophecy at the same time. The people of 1952 heard our voices before we spoke. The people of 2063 remember us before we've finished living. We are echoes between echoes, and Murfreesboro is where all the echoes meet. If you're reading this in the future, know that we heard you. We tried to understand. We preserved your voices. We listened. The tape player in the archive sits silent now, waiting for the next recording session, waiting for the next voice from a time that hasn't happened yet. The reels turn slowly when someone presses play, magnetic tape sliding past the reading head, converting invisible patterns into sound, into voices, into messages from tomorrow and yesterday, and all the times in between. Somewhere in that static, your voice might already be recorded, speaking words you haven't thought of yet, living moments you haven't reached. And somewhere in the past, someone is listening to you, wondering what it means, trying to understand why time chose this town, this place, these people to reveal its deepest secret, that it was never really linear at all. Some mysteries don't fade when the truth emerges. They only deepen into questions we're still learning how to ask. So subscribe now, because the next voice we find might be speaking directly to you.